Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, coming to you today from beautiful Singapore in Southeast Asia. And always, I'm joined by our Africa editor there over in the left box, Géraud Nima from the beautiful island of Mauritius, and also Cobus van Staden, our managing editor from Cape Town, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you both.
Good afternoon, Eric.
Well, we're doing a week in review show today, in part because the pace of news now just feels like it's on hyperdrive. So much is going on. Today, we're going to bring you three topics. I'm here in Singapore, as I mentioned, and I've had the chance to be invited by Nanyang Technological University in the Africa Studies Center here. A big shout out to Amit Jain and the wonderful team there, who really does an amazing program here. And this is the only Africa Studies Center in Southeast Asia. And this center, I have a feeling, is going to be a lot more important now in the days to come as relations between African countries and Southeast Asia become more important. And we'll talk about that coming up. We're also going to talk about some insights that I picked up here on Chinese mining strategy. And we're going to get Géraud's feedback on this. There's some very interesting insights that I picked up from some Chinese stakeholders here that I want to share with both of you. And then finally, we're going to talk to Cobus about all of the unfolding drama that's going on between the United States and South Africa and how that's going to impact South Africa's relations with China, and maybe even more broadly, China's relations with Africa. But let's start with the past couple of days that I've been here in Singapore, having some fascinating discussions with just a wide range of folks, particularly over at the NTU campus. And midweek, I gave a lecture entitled, "What Does China Want from Africa?" And it was just a lot of fun to have the chance to meet with the students, a lot of Chinese students, a lot of Singaporean students, quite a few researchers from India as well. And let me just, walk you through a little bit of what I was saying. And those of you who are watching us on YouTube will have the benefit of being able to see some of the slides. And I'll put the slide deck also in the show notes for you. And so basically the point that I was trying to make was to show that when China first went to Africa in the early 2000s, and this is in the modern era, it really was about resources in many respects. It really was about the hunt for oil, mineral, and timber, opening new markets for Chinese companies. There was excess, surplus, supply on the Chinese side. They needed to find outlets for their state-owned enterprises. And I put a slide up here, and those of you listening on the audio show, it shows that in the period from 1999 to 2004, China sourced about 30% of its oil from African countries. A lot of that came from Sudan, came from Angola and the Republic of Congo. But then as we move forward in time, China starts to, evolve its own economic strategy. And I kind of put to the students a question. I said, well, the engagement in Africa really booms until about 2013. And then I asked the students, I said, what happens in 2013? And then, of course, 2013 is the year that the Belt and Road Initiative begins. And this is when Xi Jinping went to Kazakhstan and announced it. And at that time, from 2013, we start to see a decline of Chinese oil buying from Africa, all the way from 30%. Now it goes down really below 10% today. And we're seeing that across the board in a number of different sectors. And so as you can see from the slides, and again, I'll put those slides up for folks, I kind of laid it out with data. Wasn't really trying to put any narratives about whether this is a good trend or a bad trend. And gentlemen, it's very interesting because in the room, there was a lot of engagement from the students, but over on my left-hand side, there were a couple of delegation of senior African stakeholders who were present as well. And I could tell that they were not very happy with the data and the narratives and the talk that I was giving. And when it came time to do the Q&A, the host of the program, deferred to them and said, would you like to say any comments just to kind of get the conversation going with the students and the faculty who were in the program? And their comment was they were very disappointed in the fact that I, as a white American, was coming to talk about China-Africa relations. And they, expressed their displeasure at the program. And of course, Cobus, this is something that you and I have confronted quite a bit over the past 15 years that we've done the show. But I thought it would be an interesting discussion today to talk about who tells the China-Africa story. And that was their frustration, was that they wanted Africans to be in Singapore talking to Chinese, Singaporeans, Indians, and other folks about the China-Africa story. And the fact that me as a white American male is coming to do that, they found objectionable. I understand where they're coming from. And just before I open it up for our discussion on this, I want to take us back to 2018. And I was in Beijing, and I had just done an event with one of our partner organizations in Beijing. And afterwards, a group of us with a lot of young African students went for a drink. And I could feel at the table that I was with a lot of coldness from these African students. And I said, is everything okay? Did I do anything to offend you? And they said, and Cobus, you and I had just been doing the podcast and a little bit of the site for about 8 years until that point. And they said, listen, we just don't feel that you should be doing the China-Africa project. We feel that this should be Africans doing the China-Africa project. And I said to them, I completely agree, 100%. You know that everything that we're doing, all the tools that we're using are free. Twitter, even podcasting, social media, Blogger. Why aren't you doing it? You guys are here in China. You have the expertise. I agree there should be 20 China-Africa projects out there talking about it. And then their attitude was, well, I don't have time. I'm a student. I'm busy. And I was like, okay, I get it. So let me leave the conversation there. Géraud, when I told this story to you about what happened at NTU, you 100% understood where they were coming from. Maybe kind of talk about what you think this African delegation was touching on when they expressed their displeasure of the fact that I was the one talking about this.
I think you were finding yourself in a context where you've stacked up many layers that just made your narrative and your presentation not being heard by those African delegation, because you're coming in a context where it's been for years that Africans have been frustrated to hear non-Africans talking about the relationship between Africa and China. You had many people expressing those voices, those frustration. African leaders, for instance, they would be telling you why the WTO or the IMF or the World Bank or Janet Yellen or any Western decision makers will come to Africa, telling Africans how they should be dealing with China and everything because it's disrespectful. It's as if we are child for you to come and tell us how we should be engaging with China. You had that context already happening there. And then you have the second layer of it making things difficult is the fact that you are, first of all, you're white, you're an American, and that's already made things even much more complicated. Americans in a context where you have a China-US tension that we do have right now on the international stage basically makes any Americans who talk about China, Africa needs to be really careful on the word it's using, how it's approaching the discussions to be able to be heard, not to be just stopped because you're white Americans, no, to be first of all heard about your argument. The third layers will be like, you've been invited in a third party country. So we have in white American being invited in Asian countries, Singapore, to talk to Singaporean students about China-Africa relation. So basically, all the three parts of the triangle, none of you had, quote unquote, the legitimacy to start the conversation without an African being there. So now when you have decision makers or stakeholders coming from Africa being there, they feel like, why are we talking about China-Africa here with none of you being Chinese, none of you being Africans, all of you being foreigners, but you talking about us and other countries? So only in that context there, any African decision makers or intellectual would be like, I'm not even hearing you. So which means that any kind of sound argument you'll make about it, especially if those factual arguments are counterfactual, are counterintuitive to what we would like our relationship to be with China, was not going to be heard at all. It's going to be, no, you are trying to downplay our relationship. You are trying to say that we are not important. You are trying to say that we are not valuable. We are trying to say that we're the third, fourth, fifth, sixth wheel of China's priority in the world. You are trying to tell. Basically, they will hear all of that, except the fact that, beyond, the appearances, this is what the data are telling us. And this is the problem. And I think this is the part of the narrative that you find yourself, unfortunately, in a very bad situation. If you are invited in a university in Zambia, in Kenya, in Johannesburg, in any other African country, you wouldn't have that same tension because you'd be on African soil, invited by African university, by African scholars, by African students to talk to African students about our relationship with China. You wouldn't have that problem. But all of you find yourself in a third country where none of you was Chinese or South Africans, but talking about China, Africa. I'd be like, yeah, that was recipe for this. No, not for disaster, but recipe
not
for
disaster.
Bad,
it was a recipe for a little bit of awkwardness, and some tension.
For awkwardness and for tension.
And of course,
and for,
just to point out, I 100% agree with everything you've said. But just to clarify, nothing that I was saying was meant to denigrate the relationship
that's true.
between Africa
Exactly.
and China. That's what they heard, though, of course.
Exactly.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I just want to make it clear for the audience that's not what we do.
Exactly.
Cobus, this is a complex situation for you as well because you are African, but at the same time white. So you have part of what the dilemma that I run into, but at the same time you're African. How do you've had this probably the same experience. What's your thoughts on this topic about whiteness and the ability to talk about China, Africa?
This is this. I'm busy with a project on this issue that touches deeply on this issue. So I think there's a few things to keep in mind. So I think just for context, in the first place, I believe the point that you were making in that lecture was that Africa has become less important as a source of commodities for China, but more important as a political partner.
Exactly.
Right? So that was the larger point.
The larger point, yes, exactly, is that for 400 or 500 years, Africa's value in the international system has been predicated on what comes out of the ground. And initially, that is what drew China to Africa, in part. Not exclusively, but in part. But because of the rise of the Belt and Road, China doesn't rely on Africa as much anymore because it can get oil, mineral, and timber from the Middle East, from Southeast Asia, from South America, and it's got this vast trading network. But what it can't get from the rest of the world is the political legitimacy, also the endorsement, the historical alignment between China and Africa, this very deep relationship, and politics have become much more important. And there's a currency in that politics. There's a value in that politics. And what I'm encouraging African stakeholders in BART is to find ways to better leverage that relationship to maximize it because the economic relationship isn't going to produce the dividends that they want. That's a little bit what Géraud was talking about. In part, and just we'll get back to you, Cobus, very quickly, but since we're on this subject, Géraud, you mentioned that that's not what they want to hear. Exactly. This question of that, the cobalt, the lithium, the oil, the timber is not valuable to the Chinese. And let's be clear, $295 billion of trade between the two regions. Very distorted trade, though. 70 some odd % of exports from Africa to China are extractives. Most of that's concentrated in just 5 countries. This is a highly distorted trade. And again, when you look at Africa's total trade relative to the $6 trillion of global trade that China does, it's a very small percentage. Exactly. So I was just putting that in the context. But that too, Géraud, you were talking about was not really, maybe that's what these stakeholders were responding to as well.
Exactly, because this is a reality and that many are struggling with is the fact that we don't see value in political, when you say that we are political actors, we have political value to China, we don't see that. That argument, I've made it last year when I was giving a presentation at the University of Ottawa to African students about China-Africa relation, telling them, Africa doesn't have an economic value to China, it's much more political. People really you could feel in the room that people were really not happy because as if we don't see that having political value, it's something important. For us, we see that we need to matter for tangible element. And political is not tangible because you don't measure politics. You don't measure votes, but you measure how much cobalt worth. You measure how much lithium. You measure chromium from South Africa. You measure all of that. You measure all from Nigeria, from Angola. You can measure, you can see this is geopolitical tools that we put on the table that makes us who we are. So when you come and say, you know what, it's not about that. Because in fact, when you remove South Africa from chrome, DRC from cobalt, you remove those two countries only those two countries. Everything else that remains, China can get it anywhere else in the world, cheap, less risky, and faster. And when you say that, people are saying, so you're telling me that my oil doesn't have value. You're telling me that my timber doesn't have value. That's not what I'm saying. I'm telling you that your value to China is not what you have on the ground. It's basically what you can say for China on international stage. And this is the part where we still have to make the connection that politics is also valuable, that what I'm saying is also valuable. On what I'm saying about Taiwan to China matters way more to what China's going to get out of my ground. That's the part where we're still struggling to accept, to acknowledge that yes, I don't need to bust to break my head. I just need to say, you know what, China, I will not vote for you on Taiwan. And China will be like, oh, no. We have to find a way to make them happy. But this is the part where we're still not happy about that narrative yet.
Cobus, I interrupted you, so please continue.
No, I think there's a few things to keep in mind. One is that the China-Africa studies as a field and as a kind of a topic of discussion has its own history, right? There was the fact that we as three people are discussing this on a podcast now is partly because of this an explosion of knowledge production on China-Africa relations that started from the kind of mid-2000s to now. So there was a very rapid expansion in academic, kind of tracking of the Africa-China relationship. And a lot of that happened in Western academia, so particularly in the United States. So for a long time, almost all of the people who really were pioneers in the field were American and European. And then there was a kind of a turn in the field where everyone rightly was like saying we need more African discussion here. A lot of that discussion then also shifted towards issues of recipient or local agency, like African agency around these issues. And since then, there's been a very rapid expansion of African academia on China-Africa relations. That knowledge production isn't innocent, right? Like on the one hand, So what we saw like during the same era was this like an expansion of actual knowledge, right? Kind of like amazing kind of like tools, like for example, all of these like debt trackers, that Johns Hopkins University and Boston University, for example, have put out. So there's a lot of this kind of really hardcore research on key aspects. And then at the same time, in the same era, was also an explosion of wild stories about China-Africa relations, right? The debt trap narrative being the most clear one. And in the middle of all of that, there were us, right? Kind of also talking about this, doing a podcast in an era when podcasts were not as common as they are now, kind of like featuring and churning up all of this knowledge production and discussing all of these issues. So what you have to keep in mind, right, is when Western academia tracks something, they track it because of Western concerns. Right. So whether this is the kind of crazy stories that ended up kind of serving Western interests, by trying to scare kind of global South countries about dealing with China, or whether it's actually well-founded, actual solid research, both of those things end up pushing Western agendas in different ways. So they are, by increasing Western knowledge and keeping the West as the center of knowledge, right, kind of about the world. So so you can see there why there's a kind of a chafing, against outsiders telling the story, in Africa. And at the same time, one also has to say that there's been a rapid expansion in Africans working on this issue, and many African think tanks now focus on this stuff. So there's at the same time this kind of like chafing against why are these institutions not being kind of highlighted more. I myself, fit into a very kind of complicated position in this because, I'm African, whatever you want to call that, but I'm African in the sense that my family has been in South Africa since the very early 1700s, and I don't have any other passport, right? I don't have any other. I'm not, I'm only South African. But at the same time, my structural position in South Africa is obviously I'm not only white, I'm an Afrikaner, which means I was here as Africa's biggest problem. Me and my family were here as part of Africa's biggest problem. So, so that puts me in a very kind of complicated position, kind of where I'm not one or the other. I don't see myself as from the global north, and in fact my experience, my lived experience is really over time. It's actually has pushed me has pushed further and further or more and more kind of like realizations of how I'm very much not European, I'm very much not American. Just my history of visa applications alone will show you that. So, so again, structurally I am African in that particular way, but within an African context, I don't
part
count
of
as
the
African
oppressor.
frequently, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So let me put a question to you. Both of you have raised very legitimate questions, and Cobus, it's interesting because you've talked about the Western discourse power, and Western discourse power manifests itself in all sorts of different ways. It's not just in hard power. It's not just even in Beyonce and soft power, but it's in NGOs. It's in standards. And in many ways, I guess that also includes us as well as an extension of Western discourse power, or at least me as an embodiment of that. And so that may be also something that they're resisting, is just the overwhelming power of Western discourse power to set narratives. Okay, so let's put this challenge to you. A university here in Southeast Asia or in Asia doesn't have budgets necessarily to fly people over from Africa to the think tanks, all the wonderful knowledge production that you're talking about, Cobus. Very expensive for somebody to come from South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, to come to a city like Singapore. So would it be better not to have these conversations with someone like me, or would it be better, because it's not always, it is a binary thing sometimes, does that get in the way of having the conversation? Is it better maybe to forego it?
Zoom it.
Zoom it? Okay. Yeah. That's a good
Zoom
idea.
it.
We have technology.
Yeah, technology
that's a good point.
Zoom it. It's as simple as that.
That's
because the problem is you're organizing the event for the message to get across. But if the message doesn't get across, you're failed. This is a problem because you've put all of that, you've organized everything, but if the audience is not listening, if the message doesn't get across, you have invested that much money for people just to leave frustrated, or people just to come and rally all during the conversation and saying that you don't have the legitimacy to talk about it. So you better not have that person physically there, but Zoom it as people see who's on the screen. Cobus Van Steren, I don't know, Fola Shade, or any Black African standing there talking about that than having a white Americans being physically present talking about it. That just makes the optics of it just much more awkward and difficult to overcome for many.
And I also want to leave this part of our conversation on a positive note, is that, Cobus, as you've talked about in Africa that there's been a growth of scholarship on this, I was very excited to see how many PhD and master's students from China who I met were doing PhDs in China-Africa relations, PhD in global South studies. They were exciting. They were fascinating. They were absolutely engaged. It gives you a lot of hope that there's a new generation of young scholars coming up in China who are educated around the world in places like here in Singapore. And I just want to give a shout out to them because I had a chance to meet with a lot of them as well. And they're very excited about the field. And this is not something, by the way, that I see in the US or Europe right now. And so to see so many people young people interested in global South studies, specifically in Africa studies, from China, was something very exciting. So really interesting conversations. Very good for sometimes to do this self-reflection. I appreciate and these are, by the way, everybody listening and watching at home, these are the kinds of conversations that we literally have amongst each other. And after the session yesterday, I called up Géraud and I called up Cobus, and we actually had this very conversation. I said, let's do this on the show because I think it's so important to talk about these very sensitive, complex issues in terms of who gets to tell the story, how do you tell the story, and all the different dynamics kind of makes us better and stronger. So I do, by the way, have another presentation tonight. So Géraud, I hope it goes better on that sense. But again, let's see. Luckily we have a sense of humor and a little bit of humility about this. So anyway, one of the other conversations that I had earlier this week was with a number of corporate stakeholders, and I was giving a chat. We were talking about U.S. China, U.S. Africa, U.S. Southeast Asia, and it was a general chat with high-level corporate folks. And there were some Chinese folks from the mining industry. And after our discussion, I went up to these gentlemen and I said, I have a question that I've been burning to ask. And my colleague Géraud and I have been following the company CMOC Group. And if you're not familiar with CMOC Group, they are the largest cobalt producer. They own the Tenke-Fungurume mine in the DRC. They have operations around the world. And last year, they produced a record amount of cobalt, even though cobalt is at record lows now, just $11 a pound. Now, back in 2018, cobalt was at, what, Géraud, $44 a pound? I mean, huge. And we've been asking the question on the show and in our newsletters and in our analysis, it doesn't make economic sense that CMOC Group and other Chinese mining companies would be pumping out so much cobalt when the price is at rock bottom lows. And the theory that I had, and I think you might have had the same theory, Géraud, was that one of the reasons was for geopolitical reasons, was because by keeping the price low and flooding the market on a critical resource like this, it keeps private companies in the US, Australia, and Europe on the sidelines, and it prevents them from competing with Chinese companies. I brought this theory to these two mining executives from China, and they had a wonderful sense of humor. It was a wonderful conversation. And they laughed at me in a very kind of friendly way. They said, Eric, not everything is about the U.S. Not everything is about Europe. Not everything is about geopolitical competition. Take yourself out of the center of everything. And I was like, okay, then what is this about? And they made the point that Chinese President Xi Jinping has promised that by 2050, China will be carbon neutral. Okay? If China is going to be carbon neutral in the next 25 years, it's going to need an incredible amount of battery storage to offset the fossil fuel energy that they've been producing. No. And if you are sitting in the year 2045 and you are the guy who bought cobalt at $11 a pound when it was at a record low price, you're going to seem like a genius. What they explained to me was that I'm not looking at this in the right time frame. They're not buying cobalt for today or tomorrow. They're stockpiling cobalt for 10, 15, 20 years from now when they're going to need huge amounts of battery storage and maybe other uses for transition minerals. Géraud, when I brought this argument to you, what's your reaction?
It makes sense. It makes perfect sense. It makes economic and geostrategic sense, and it really shows you that how it's a long-term game. And when I told you it was a long game because I just finished reading the report from A-Data talking about China, how China managed to get a grip on critical raw materials of the last 20 years. And you could see that it was really a long-term game that started to play since early 2001. So this is the same thing that we see now. And when you look into the China energy mix, you look into China's energy demand and consumption, and you look at the forecast, it really just makes sense to you that yes, energy storage is going to be one of the leading industry that's going to require cobalt in the future. And when you look into now the way China is using, because right now cobalt is the highest demand for cobalt. We have it in EV batteries. So when you see China buying up cobalt, you'd assume that it's going to fuel into the EV industry. But when you go to the EV industry in China, you realize that NMC batteries, nickel manganese cobalt batteries, are going on the low, and LFP batteries, lithium iron phosphate batteries, on the high, and all any other batteries without cobalt are on the rise.
And that's not just in China. Just to be clear, the new Chevy Bolt 2025 that's coming out is going to be an LFP battery.
Yes.
And LFP batteries now have shorter recharge cycles. They can generate as much power, and they don't generate as much heat, so there's less risk of fire.
Exactly.
And so those are all reasons why battery manufacturers are shifting and automakers are shifting to battery makers. But Géraud, you also brought up the point that it's not even just for China, because China wants to build battery storage for power grids in Saudi Arabia, in South Africa, around the world. So this cobalt then that they're buying today, coming out of the Tenke mine and elsewhere, may be put into a giant grid-wide battery storage system for Johannesburg one day.
Yes, it's going to be part of what China energy security is about, not only in China but also overseas. And you see that, as I was saying, that the way China is developing the current market. When you look at the current market, the way it's behaving, in Europe it's still a debate between LFP and NMC. In the US it's still the same. But China is very much the one driving the seat of like, I'm getting out of cobalt industry in terms of batteries, but I'm still buying cobalt, I'm stockpiling cobalt. Which tells you that in the next 20, 30 years, when we're going to be really carbon neutral, a country like China is going to be carbon neutral, you're going to need much more storage, energy storage. China is going to be sitting on a gold mine of all wide range of like technology and everything, and we're gonna be down the line there producing the research that A-Data has produced today to understand how in 2024 China was still flooding the market for cheap cobalt to allow it to stockpile cobalt. And that's insight they gave. It's really interesting because at the end, the introduction they've made, like it's just give you a different perspective. Like you have to remove US-centered or Western-centered views of the world on those kind of issues. Sometimes it's just about China own security strategy, long-term economic development. And if it happens that the US is just an accident, like collateral damage in that progress of what they're building, it's not about you, but it's just more about us. And this is, I think, it was really enlightening as comment they've made. But it just makes sense. It totally makes sense.
And let me just put a disclaimer out there. These two folks that I spoke with do not work for CMOC Group. They're not affiliated with CMOC Group. This was just their theory. We were just talking about this casually. But Cobus, what I found most interesting was how quick they were to gently, friendly, scold me by saying, it's not always about you and the U.S. Stop centering yourself in everything. And that I felt was very, very interesting and helpful as well.
Well, yes. I was laughing at us, for our kind of confusion, because one thing I think it revealed is I think people people embedded in the kind of Western world, I think are so used to governments not taking their own climate goals seriously, that having a government actually take their own climate goals seriously and invest in it is somehow a startling concept. So that was kind of funny for me. I think, I would also add that I think, like, I fully agree with Géraud. It's like, this kind of, even though they're moving out of cobalt now, cobalt may well have kind of other kind of like values in the future, especially also for other still to emerge technologies. So I think China is kind of is stockpiling a lot of these minerals, including also rare earth minerals, which I recently saw they kind of not only producing at home, obviously most of it, but also importing very, very kind of like
large amounts
actively from other parts of the world, like Vietnam, for example. And so so all of this has to do with not only like proven technologies of the future, but yet to be developed technologies of the future. We should also say that China, for example, has recently had a very underreported, but a very large advance in fusion energy production. Like they managed to kind of make a fusion reaction run doubly as long as anyone else has managed to do it. So there's this really kind of very futuristic work being done in China, around kind of future energies. And so in this context, I can see why Africans are pushing back so hard against this narrative that the commodities are not as important. Exactly. Because, in this longer term thing, they like, wait a minute, like if we're talking about the entire kind of decarbonization of all economies around the world, and we're saying that a lot of those minerals are in Africa at scale, then we can't have a conversation about how those commodities are not important anymore, right? Kind of. So
yeah, but they're not only in Africa at scale. I mean, let's be clear,
exactly.
Lithium is found everywhere. Nickel is found in Indonesia. A lot of these are found all over the world and not exclusively in Africa.
This
exactly, but also this conversation also goes for other parts of the world, right? Kind of like other parts of the world which are also devalued because they're seen as just backlots with minerals under the ground, right? So it feeds into a wider kind of longer conversation. Sorry, Géraud, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add on that the part of like those minerals are widespread everywhere, and it's a sobering conversation when you do the research on those topics. And most Africans, you say, when we talk about critical minerals, you say Africa is at the center, but not the whole Africa. Because basically, it's just like a handful of country in one land, like South Africa from chrome and platinum, DRC for cobalt, Mozambique for manganese, Gabon for manganese, and South Africa, Mozambique for phosphate, I believe, if I get my graphite,
Zambia copper,
for graphite, even
Nigeria,
not Zambia,
lithium.
even if not Zambia, because when you look at Africa's shares of lithium, for example, is less than 6% of the world. So basically, you have lithium everywhere else in the world. So even in that spot only, you realize that, guys, we have to be humble in a certain extent, unless we find new deposits. But based on the current data that we do have, we're important, but we are not that important to believe that we are at the center of the conversation, where if we are not there, things will fall apart. This is something that I think that sometimes many Africans, we are not pleased to have that kind of conversation when those data are thrown to us.
Well, let's bring it into the present week. And Géraud, China retaliated this week against U.S. sanctions against China. And among China's measures that it pushed back on the U.S. was to restrict access to 4 critical resources. Tell us about that and whether or not it's important. Is there any Africa connection to these resources that the Chinese are putting tariffs on and limiting the flow to the United States? And is this the beginning, do you think, of the weaponization of China's command of the critical resource supply chain, particularly in processing, that we could see more of? And the last time that China did this with germanium, I think that's how you say it.
Yeah, germanium, yes.
Your compatriots in the Democratic Republic of Congo moved very quickly and said, hey, everybody, if China's not going to sell you germanium, we will. So is there a opportunity here in this U.S.-China spat and trade war that's starting to get underway for African countries to backfill on some of these resources?
Yes, because China has put ban on tungsten, tellurium, and molybdenum in terms of export to the U.S. because they really wants to target or to retaliate, as you said, retaliate against the measure that Donald Trump is planning to take or has already been taken on China. And from China, they're going to tell you, we are not starting it, we are reacting to it. So when you're telling us that we are the one who started it, we didn't start it, we're just being retaliating on what has been taken, what has been done to us. So what African can do, of course, you have many African countries can really try to take advantage of the context of like, you know what, if China is imposing an export ban on them, we can try to take advantage. But the reality is many African, not many African countries actually, you don't have a lot of them who can produce tungsten, tellurium or molybdenum to the scale where they can take advantage of it. This is the part where many Africans have been saying, you know what, we need to invest much more in exploration to allow us to discover much more new deposit of new minerals to allow us to move, to be able to be in that part of the conversation. And the reality now, you're going to have Brazil taking advantage, you're going to have Vietnam taking advantage, but African countries are going to be, South Africa has a certain extent where you can find tungsten a bit, but not to the scale of trying to scale the balance that has been upset by China's measures on the ground. So this is a part that's going really to be interesting, and to see how now African countries in general, not only regarding to that, are going to want to exist in the overall debate on critical minerals in the world in the future.
And they're not processed, so you may get raw minerals from African countries, but China has a dominating share of the processing of these minerals.
And this is even the part where China is very much dominating, because people try to forget that in the whole spectrum of critical minerals, China dominates, except for graphite, except for rare earth. China dominance is very much not in the upstream on terms of mining and exploration, but in the midstream and downstream in terms of processing, transformation, and manufacturing of the end product. This is where China really holds an enormous power. That's why, for example, early January, they decided, you know what, we're going to now impose export ban or export control on processed lithium to Europe, because the Europe depends not on raw lithium, but it depends on processed and advanced processed lithium from China. So even when China starts to move on that, on moving on the lithium and also on the technology behind that, this is where many countries are now starting really to grasp how much they're depending on China for the technological advancement on those critical raw materials.
Well, let's continue our discussion now on what's going on between the U.S. and China, and also, of course, between the U.S. now and South Africa. That, too, this week has come into the picture, and we're going to talk about this in the context, again, of China. But let me just kind of back everybody up into the story, simply if you've not been following it. It's not your fault if you've not been following it, because there's been 50 different storylines coming out of Washington, making it almost impossible to keep track of everything that is going on. So let me start with a soundbite that came after Donald Trump posted a tweet, or what he calls a truth social, criticizing South Africa and using a lot of the same language in his post that Elon Musk, who of course is a native South African, has been talking about in terms of land. And I'm going to let Cobus get us into the details on this, what it is. But let me just set it up now with a couple sound bites that I want you to react to. So here is Donald Trump this week talking about South Africa. And there's a lot of background noise here because he's on the tarmac just ready to board his plane.
Terrible things are happening in South Africa. The leadership is doing some terrible things. It's horrible things. So that's under investigation right now. We'll make a determination. They're taking away land, they're confiscating land, and actually they're doing things that are perhaps far worse than that.
Terrible, horrible things. He's used very strong language. Now, this provoked a very passionate response in South Africa among a number of groups. It was very easy to find a lot of outrage on social media. People are angry. Julius Malema, who is the head of the EFF, a party there, spoke out today as well on this issue. But let's take a listen to some of the coverage on the state broadcaster SABC, and just to get a flavor of what's going on. And then, Cobus, I'm going to come to you to help us explain.
Group of about a dozen civil society organizations have lambasted Donald Trump for his serious allegations about South Africa. The U.S. president claimed without proof that the country is confiscating land and treating certain people very badly. He's threatened to cut off future funding. The organizations, which include Ahmed Kathrada, Desmond Tutu Foundations, and Defend Our Democracy Movement, say Trump's allegations are absurd and dangerous. The U.S. president's remarks prompted a response from government and saw the rand taking a massive knock yesterday before recovering slightly. Political economist Mweli Tsimbeki says South Africa's response to Trump highlights deeper issues within the government.
Cobus, before we get to the impact on China-South Africa relations, help us understand what to make of all of this and what the reaction is on the ground in South Africa.
Okay. So the few things to keep in mind here. So one of the ways that apartheid worked was to push black people off the land. right? Kind of so black people were essentially declared to be foreigners in their own country, officially, citizens of these kind of fake little micro countries that were created by the apartheid state, and so they were treated as basically as immigrants in their own country. And in the process, they were pushed through colonialism, through Afrikaner nationalism, and through apartheid itself. They were pushed off land more and more and more. So what's the situation is now is that still, 25 years after the end of apartheid, the land ownership in South Africa is extremely skewed. The vast majority of particularly productive agricultural land still belong to white people. You're talking about like well north of 50%, kind of like around 80%. The last time I saw. So the government has been trying for a long time. This is one of South Africa's biggest political issues. Like this is one of the most, like the lack of access to land is one of the most explosive issues in South African politics. And there's a good reason why. I mean, decades after the end of apartheid, black South Africans are asking like, wait, why are we still not having access to this land? It's our land. So, and keep in mind that when they were pushed off it was expropriated, in extremely kind of clumsy and unfair ways. People were literally kind of like their houses were bulldozed and they were dumped by the side of the road, essentially, right? So since the end of apartheid, the government has been trying to fix the situation, trying to get more black people back onto their land, trying to fix some of these old untreated land restitution crises. In different areas. And they've been using a principle called willing buyer, willing seller, right? Kind of, which basically market-based principles, right? Kind of looking for farmers who want to sell, white farmers who want to sell anyway, and then facilitating ways to try and kind of return some of the original communities back to that land. That hasn't really worked. It hasn't moved the needle, right? Kind of, there isn't really more black people owning that land now than there used to be. So now they move to a version of the U.S. eminent domain law, right? Kind of, it's the Land Expropriation Act, the Land Expropriation Without Compensation Act, even though that name sounds quite weighty, is essentially almost identical to U.S. eminent domain law, right? Kind of like it says that the state can sometimes force people to sell their land at, using a complicated set of checks and balances to avoid injustice, but for the larger good, the state can sometimes force people to sell their land, right? Like for example, if you're building a huge interstate, and there's one person there who refuses to sell their house, and holding up a project. In the US, there are legal ways to make that person sell that land, right? Kind of for the greater good, right? So that is essentially what they're trying to use. Over the last few years, and this is where it becomes very Trumpy and very interesting. Like over the last few years, there's been a kind of a form of narrative crafting and narrative planting that all of this is that high levels of crime on South African farms is part of a quote unquote white genocide, right? Kind of like where kind of white farmers, where crime, like under the pretext of crime, white farmers are being murdered, and they are kind of in order to kind of push them off the land.
And this is a campaign, just to pick up on that, this is a campaign that Tucker Carlson has picked up on. Yes. And then most notably Elon Musk now, and that Trump is parroting a lot of the language coming out of right-wing U.S. media that's picked up on this and put it into the U.S. culture war.
Exactly. So this is like classic, like Fox News, right? Kind of like the Fox News has been running with this for years. It's also been picked up, interestingly, by the right wing in Europe. Like I remember, maybe 7-8 years ago, being contacted by all these journalists from Eastern Europe, being like, "Oh, tell us about white genocide." I'm like, there is no white genocide. White people in South Africa are still some of the most privileged people in the world. Let's keep that in mind. Like, they're still some of the most privileged people in the world. So now the language of genocide and discrimination, racism, like apartheid, all of this is being used in this fantasy way, right? Kind of in in right-wing discourse. The fact that Elon Musk and Trump picked up on this story rather than on other beefs with South Africa shows, I think, how the US discourse is increasingly being hijacked by this kind of right-wing narrative.
Well, to be fair, to be fair, Cobus, it's not only this. This is the culmination of maybe at least a year, if not more, of mounting U.S. frustration with South Africa over, and let's just kind of make a short list here, over South Africa's participation in the BRICS, over the joint military exercises with China and Russia, over the fact that they were not going to arrest Putin if he came to the BRICS summit, potentially, under the auspices of the International Criminal Court.
Well, they made him not come.
Made him not come, but again, they waffled, and the Americans got upset about that. And then, of course, on the strong position that South Africa took against Israel in the International Court of Justice. And then now recently a headline came out just today that says Taiwan says South Africa has given March deadline to move liaison office from Pretoria. Again, another move that has frustrated and angered, forcing Taiwan to move its representative office from the capital Pretoria to the commercial center in Johannesburg. And you hear from conservative think tank analysts, namely Joshua Meservey from the Hudson Institute and others, who consistently say that South Africa is not aligning itself with U.S. foreign policy priorities, and then maybe should be chastised for it. And then we had about 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, a column in the Wall Street Journal on the editorial and opinion page, which said that if South Africa does not get its act together, then Donald Trump should sanction South Africa and isolate South Africa. And so all of this has been building up to these tweets where we are right now.
But
so
Eric,
it's a culmination there.
Now, Eric, allow me to add on something. When you listen to the soundbite that Donald Trump has made, the comment is made, among the things that you've listed, knowing how is anti-China, anti-all of it,
let's not say Trump is anti-China, by the way.
Let's
be very clear here. We don't know that yet.
Let's say he has an entourage of people who have expressed to be anti-China within his administration. Given that those people are sometimes also part of his foreign policies, you would have imagined that he would have used one of those key points, those key elements, to raise why South Africans should be either sanctioned or not receiving U.S. aid. But he did not pick up in all those issues that are quote unquote, I would say, international, or where the U.S. can say, I have something to say because my interest is involved there. He only picked on issues that are very much a national, local issue internally.
No, it's a white grievance issue, though, as Cobus was pointing out.
Exactly.
And that plays very well in the United States and Europe.
Exactly.
Well,
but this is the part where Cobus said that he's picking up on the discourse is being hijacked by internal politics of the US now, using it as the entry point, where actually you realize that I believe when I heard this comment, I felt that I had someone who was not totally informed completely of the fact of what was happening. He just picked up one of issue. That's why the comment was quite vague. Some terrible things I've done. They're doing some bad things. But what the specifics are talking about, this is the part where I say someone just whispered in his ear, South Africa is doing something bad to us.
Well, that someone we know who that someone is.
I don't want to speculate.
It's not a mystery that Elon Musk is doing this. And so, Cobus, let's bring this to China, because I'm not sure I always believe in coincidences when it comes to China, but it just so happens that on Thursday of this week, as we are recording this, there was an article in the China Daily newspaper, one of the Chinese state media's most prominent publications, that says, quote, here's the headline, South Africa eyes stronger relations with China in 2025. Let's kind of forecast this down the road over the next 3 to 6 months, play this out. It's entirely possible that, given what we've seen from the Trump administration and some of the unpredictability and how they've gone after Canada, Colombia, Greenland, Panama, I mean, these are very close friends. They've clearly laid the groundwork that South Africa is not a close friend. And with what they've done to Canada and Panama is any indication, you should be prepared to be, whacked in South Africa, potentially, okay? If that happens, let's assume then that AGOA, which is the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is a free trade agreement between several dozen African countries and the United States, not all African countries. South Africa accounts for about a third of that, 25% to 30% of AGOA, is not going to be renewed. It doesn't seem likely in this environment. Does that headline, South Africa eyes stronger relations with China in 2025, matter more to South Africa this year then? Will China become more important if the relationship with the United States sours?
Well, firstly, one has to say that the South Africans don't want the relationship with the United States to sour, right? Kind of the South Africans they want a diversified partnership. They've had very good relationships with the US and Europe for a long time. They also want the right to align themselves with who they see fit, and the right that every sovereign country has to make its own foreign policy decisions. So the idea that South Africa is somehow that it's somehow okay to punish a sovereign country for their completely legitimate foreign policy decisions is absurd. So that the US taking that stance and making clear that that it has. Like if they pick this fight with Canada, then if they pick any fight with Canada, then they're willing to pick a fight with anyone else as well, right? Kind of like no one is closer to the US than Canada, right? So in that sense, so I think South Africa is being made an example of, because there's many countries that have close relationships with China. There's many countries that have much closer relationships with China than South Africa does. I mean, when you speak to Chinese stakeholders in South Africa, they're frequently complaining that the relationship isn't as close as they'd like it to be. So, so the South Africans frequently hold the Chinese at arm's length, actually, that in reality, on a bunch of issues, around trade, for example. So, so it's not true that South Africa has this outlier, super close relationship with China. They have a similar relationship with China as many other global South countries have. The reason
Except
I think
the BRICS
South Africa,
relationship and the military joint exercises, that doesn't happen with a lot of other countries.
Oh,
but it
Algeria,
happens with
Nigeria,
some.
Mozambique,
Nigeria, Vietnam.
Seychelles.
Well, those are ports of
Indonesia.
calls. No, to be
Kenya.
clear, Géraud, those are all ports of call. They're not exercises.
No, they did exercise. They did exercise with some other countries in Africa. China
Okay.
did some other exercise with other African.
But in Nigeria, it was a port of call. Yeah.
yeah.
The thing I think is that I think that one of the reasons why South Africa is being made a scapegoat is because so South Africa kind of called out war crimes in Israel, right? In the process, kind of embarrassing the United States, and kind of for its support there. That can't be separated from South Africa's own apartheid history. Two things to keep in mind. The apartheid was directly built into Western power, right? Kind of that is what apartheid did, is it served Western power. There's a reason why the mining company that funneled all of the gold into the Western market in South Africa is called Anglo-American, right? So South Africa was in a structural position in relation to Western power. Apartheid wasn't just some kind of like terrible thing happening far away. It was part of Western power. And so when South Africa challenged that, and South Africa refused to play that role anymore, it changed its position, right? And in the process of calling out to this situation in Israel, it highlighted the embeddedness of certain systems within Western power. So at a moment when when there's a kind of an openly racist turn in the United States, right? Kind of like through the elimination of diversity departments in companies, the outlawing of diversity, initiatives in some ways. This issue of making past racial injustices right has now put South Africa in the center of a huge culture war within the United States, right? So the kind of the symbolic position of South Africa and the symbolic position of apartheid in relation to Western power was something that has never really been unpacked, right? Kind of like how central that has been to Western power has never really been explored, because it's so embarrassing to Western power, right? Kind of like no one wants to think of themselves as complicit with apartheid, but they were, right? Kind of like Ronald Reagan was defending apartheid until literally about 3 years before it fell down on its own, right? Same thing with Margaret Thatcher. They were propping up and defending apartheid for Cold War strategy reasons, right? Kind of for decades. So all of that history has now flown back into the present. All of that issues that make South Africa so symbolic, kind of in these wider disputes around, for example, the stuff that Donald Trump was saying about Gaza. Like kind of this I think is the reason why it's South Africa is actually being targeted, and this is and that was made clear by the fact that this Fox News talking point ended up being the reason why.
Okay.
Right? It wasn't even about China.
Let me just kind of try and pressure you a little bit to answer the question on, does this change the South Africa-China relationship? Does China see an opportunity here to deepen its ties in South Africa to help make up for maybe some of the loss of trade and potentially even of aid? With the closure of the U.S. Agency for International Development and the PEPFAR program that was providing up to 17% of some of the antiretrovirals in South Africa, which, by the way, African governments are rallying right now to make up the funds for themselves on this. Nonetheless, does this provide an opportunity for China to change its diplomacy in South Africa?
I think China sees opportunities, but I don't know that it's particularly crafting a South Africa specific strategy. I think what we're seeing actually is the emergence of a new global trade regime, right? Kind of where because the United States is increasingly kind of like removing itself from a lot of these relationships, China is emerging as everyone else's second best choice, right? And I think that is true in South Africa because a lot of those trade relationships exist already. So South Africa has not been able to depend on only Western trade, because there wasn't enough of it, and so it needed to diversify its partnerships anyway. China is a big important market that wants to buy some stuff that South Africa exports, so there'll be more of that. I don't know that I necessarily see that much more close kind of relationship, like it's not a kind of an iron brotherhood like the way that China has with Pakistan, right? I think what it will be is just South Africa is desperately looking for alternatives to the United States, like everyone else is.
And I'm glad you brought that up. Let me just very quickly mention the fact that just this week, whether again by design or by coincidence, Deputy Minister Thandi Moroka from South Africa held the second ASEAN-South Africa Joint Sectoral Cooperation Committee meeting. And you are going to see a lot more of these kinds of meetings with Southeast Asia, because I think Southeast Asia is going to emerge as a potential trading partner for a lot of these countries that do want to reduce their exposure to the U.S. market and their dependence on the U.S. market. Countries like Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia are potentially very lucrative markets, and even places like Vietnam that have a large growing middle class. But there was a meeting this week in Cape Town that took place between South African and ASEAN ministers. And I think those normal diplomatic kind of handshaking kind of meetings now take on a whole different level of importance. Géraud, we're going to give you the last word because we got to wrap up and get out of here.
Yes, my only advice to South African would be like to take advantage of the situation in a sense where now, as Cobus mentioned, when we see the United States removing itself from international organization and everything, it's basically leaving spaces for China or for other countries to really be in there and shape the narrative, to shape the norms, of international anything in terms of norms, in terms of regime. And I think that South Africans should be now taking the opportunity to say, maybe we have an opportunity with China and other countries within or outside the BRICS to shape the international system right now. And I think that, yes, they should definitely go more toward China and really more pushing for BRICS to become much more substantive and really going to the places where, guys, now we have the space. The United States doesn't want to be here. Let us be here, start to shape what those international organizations should be about. And I think that, for me, would be the advice to South Africans. They should really move on.
I'm going to add on that I think you're going to see a lot of middle power states and upper middle power states, if you will, like the United Arab Emirates and Turkey and others that are going to contribute more to these multilateral organizations to have a greater voice and greater share. So a lot of the impact that people want from the BRICS of a diversifying of the discourse in the global conversation is going to happen, but not necessarily from the major powers, but it might come from some of these upper middle powers as well. Cobus, I said that Géraud would get the last word. I do want to give you one final thought that you can share with everybody before we go.
South Africa is a very feisty little country, right? Kind of like it always kind of punches above its weight, and it has a lot of internal divisions and a lot of internal issues and a lot of dysfunction. But this kind of external pressure, it was very funny. Like, it really, like, how angry the South Africans were and how they were, like, kind of pushing back against it. And I think all of this is gonna have like interesting kind of complications on the international stage, right? Kind of because in the first place, this language of punishing South Africa, you know, it's like, okay, great. So you know, kind of like PEPFAR has now been suspended. So now actual South Africans will die. Is that enough punishment? Great. You know, so the kind of it really, I think. It really, I think, kind of like put a kind of an anger at the heart, I think, of South Africans in looking at the United States for targeting this kind of particular program where South Africa is a world leader, where it's done so much with the PEPFAR money, like really, like on another level, and which was a very successful and fruitful collaboration, right? Kind of like, and particularly something to target public health in a poor country in this kind of weaponized way. I think that alone, I think, you know. But so South Africa also is, you know, is the head of the G20 this year. There's already rumors that the US might not go to the G20 because South Africa is so anti-American.
They said it.
But yeah, you know, kind of so you know, so there South Africa.
Well, they just don't
busy.
like multilateral discussions like.
Yeah, exactly.
It may not
so
have anything to do with South Africa, but just Trump at a multilateral forum in an America First era doesn't really make sense.
Rubio really made it.
Yeah, so therefore, it's kind of like post US multilateralism, right?
Correct. That's where we are.
Yeah, you know, so another place where the US isn't. And then South Africa has also recently come together with a bunch of other Global South countries as a coalition to defend the International Court of Justice. You know, so it is this kind of interesting thing where South Africa is also, you know, there's this idea of this kind of liberal international order based on institutions, which was always like trumpeted as being, you know, kind of the center of Western Enlightenment. As you know, South Africa is now working to try and kind of build support in the global South for that, right? So we're also looking at a post-West liberalism. You know, that's so in lots of ways. I think, you know, this is kind of kicking off, you know, the larger kind of processes that will end up really reshaping international power, and I think reshaping US influence in the process. And we don't know how that's going to work. Yeah. But you know, but the thing is, South Africa is suffering, but South Africa also has some of its own cards to play. You know, kind of so it seems like such an unnecessary kind of ruining of something that was working quite well, actually.
Exactly.
Yeah, several scholars that I spoke with over the past couple of weeks, Chinese scholars, I've asked them, I said, how will China respond to this? You talked about South Africa's feisty response. Canada responded very angrily. A lot of passions and protests in Panama City as well. And I said, how do you think China is going to respond, particularly in the global South? And what folks told me was they're going to wait. You're not going to see a strong Chinese response right now. They're going to see how this plays out. First and foremost for Xi is not necessarily to expand Chinese influence in the global South. First and foremost is to protect the Chinese domestic economy and to make sure that the impact of any U.S.-China tensions don't exacerbate China's already troubled economy in many respects. So I think for a lot of people looking for China to throw a punch at the Americans may be disappointed, at least for now. And that may take some time. So I think I agree with you, Cobus, that we're not going to see any dramatic moves from Chinese Ambassador Wu Peng in Pretoria to all of a sudden announce that they're going to do these big kind of dramatic things. They have to see how this plays out. Let's remember, we're not even a month into the Trump administration, not even a month. So we got a long way to go, and I think they're going to play. It's a long way to go. But one of the things that we're doing at the China Global South Project, as we are doing on this podcast, is trying to figure out this new world order that we're in. The rules have been reset. Everything has been reset. We're in a different era after January 20th, 2025. I've been saying to folks that I think this is as monumental as November 9th, 1989, when young people jumped up on the Berlin Wall and the East German guards opened up the gates, and that was the end of Soviet communism. To me, and it sounds dramatic, but I think we're in a period as monumental as that was. As Cobus mentioned, the United States is withdrawing from many of these spaces, many of the institutions that the United States built over the past 75 years. It's abandoning, like USAID and multilateral institutions. So we're trying to figure all this out. How does it impact China? How does it impact the Global South? That's what we're doing over on our site. Géraud and Cobus and Johnny and Edwin and Lucy. We have a great team in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East that are thinking and doing all this great work every day. And we're engaging scholars and analysts and journalists from the Global South to write about these issues. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe if you'd like to follow the work that the team is doing. Subscriptions are very affordable, and we really appreciate your support. And of course, if you're a student or a teacher, you get half off. Email me, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I will send you the links for the half off discount codes. Once again, I want to give a big shout out to Amit Jain and the team at Nanyang Technological University and the Africa Studies Center for their very gracious invitation to invite me to Singapore this week. Next week, I'll be joining you from Jakarta, Indonesia. Not talking about Africa things. So I think it'll be, we're talking about nickel mining, but we're not talking about Africa things. So I think it'll be a little bit safer turf for me on that one. But we'll be joining you from Jakarta, Indonesia. So for Géraud in Mauritius and Cobus in Cape Town, I'm Eric, joining you today from Singapore. We'll be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. Until then, we'll see you then.